Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm excited to get to convene this conversation with some of my favorite folks from Redemption Church, where I pastor. Redemption has the good fortune of having a lot of psychological and mental health and therapy experts. And it seemed like this would be a good time to get a few of those folks together and have a conversation about coping with the stress of the COVID-19 virus and its impact on our lives, especially in regard to how to stay healthy, how to deal with the stress of this time, both as just people, adults, but also as parents. Thinking of this particularly for myself as a dad, like I know my kids, but I don't know the ins and outs of what this is doing to them. And so I thought it would be good to get some folks together who could speak to that intelligently and help guide and instruct us through this time. So I have a panel here. Elizabeth Diddle, Kristin Suttle, Paul Hoard, Mike Vogel have joined Lonnie McGee, our youth pastor, and we're grateful that you guys are here. I'm going to have you just run around and everybody just kind of give us a quick rundown on what you do, just a little bit of your bio. So let's start, Mike, with you.
Hi, well, hopefully you remember me. I'm the one chasing a little 2-foot blonde boy. He runs in circles. And my name is Mike Vogel. I am, by training, a clinical psychologist. And I've studied things like development and trauma and psychoanalysis, and work a lot with parents and adult survivors of trauma and some of these things. So I'm really humbled to be part of this community and grateful for this opportunity to share and contribute as we all work our way through this.
Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, my name's Paul Hoard. I'm an assistant professor at Mid-American Nazarene University, where I teach in the Master of Arts in Counseling program. I'm also a licensed clinical professional counselor. And so a lot of my background stems particularly with working with adolescents with a variety of different types of trauma and acting out aggressive behaviors. So in that I teach also in the child and adolescent class and do a lot of post-grad supervision of therapists in the area as well, focusing primarily on on adolescents, parenting, as well as sort of sexual issues, but then also kind of children, general mental health issues. So thanks so much, Tim, for letting me be a part of this.
Yeah, sure. Elizabeth, how about you?
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth Diddle. Brian and I have been coming to Redemption for about 3 years now and love this family. I'm the director of student counseling and wellness at Mid-America Nazarene University. So I work exclusively with traditional age kids, about 18 to 24 in that area. And I view it, I work a little bit different than the other guys, and then it's viewed through a social work lens, which is puts kind of a little bit different light on it. So that's what I do.
Excellent, thanks. And Cole, just tell us a little bit about you.
I'm the youth pastor at Redemption Church. I've been a pastor for now over a decade, which is crazy. And I spend a lot of time with students, and I think the nature of my job is one that I don't have a lot of power over students. So young people tend to be different around me than they are around a lot of adults. And so I think just the behavior side of things, I understand on some level just how kids work in real time and space. And hopefully I can bring something to the conversation.
Yeah, excellent. Kristin.
I'm Kristin Suttle. I am married to Tim Suttle. So I've been married to a pastor, not a pastor, for over 20 years. I, by education, have a master's in counseling, master's of arts in counseling, and I'm in private practice where I see a pretty equal amount of teens, married adults, unmarried adults who are working through life events and just anxiety, depression, traumatic events earlier in their life or traumatic events that they're currently dealing with. So hopefully I can add something. I think I'm a little more of a jack of all trades. We have 2 teenage boys, and hopefully I can speak from a mother's perspective as well.
Excellent. Very good. Well, thanks you guys for being here. I'm going to maybe just try to throw some questions out there that I'm wondering about, but feel free to hijack the conversation and talk amongst yourselves because this is your field. So I think the initial question that I just want to throw out there is, for me as a father of teenage kids, I'm watching my kids and trying to pay attention to how they're reacting, but I'm just aware that I don't understand psychology. I don't have a base of knowledge to work from. And I'm just wondering, what is this doing to them? What are they dealing with? How does this register with our kids? And maybe we can just start there. Anybody got a comment on that one?
Tim, I do think that this Generation Z, they were already feeling isolated, more isolated than past generations. So to add that into the mix, we really have to understand that they don't have the capacity to handle it as well as maybe we did when we were teenagers. And so giving a lot of grace on that and talking a lot about what isolation means, because screens have made them more isolated anyway. And so now we've even added more to that. And so the isolation adds anxiety and that kind of thing. So just not trying to view it from how I reacted when I was a teenager, but trying to live right in the moment where they are right now.
Good. You used the word anxiety, and I hear that word a lot. I think I've had to deal with some myself, but I wonder if somebody could talk about what the difference is between like legitimate anxiety and just run-of-the-mill worries. Like what do we mean when we say anxiety? Did that make you anxious? Did that question make you anxious? Who wants that?
Well, I don't want to be the only one to speak on this conference. So if I start taking over, you guys can like cut me off or whatever.
Go for it.
But what a lot of research shows is that anxiety often comes from not living in the present moment, but from either being all worked up about the past that you can't control or fretting about the future that you can't control. So this virus would be an optimal time to be fretting about a future you can't control. And so anxiety, the antidote in some ways, or one way is that practice of staying in the present moment and being mindful and trying to live like that right now when everything else is out of control. So to me, a lot of anxiety is the time traveling mind that just can't stay focused in this very moment. So that's one part of anxiety, but these guys have other. Kristin and everybody else pop in here.
No, I agree with you, Elizabeth, and I appreciate you kind of just jumping in there, getting things going. I think on my end, I'm trying to absolutely think through, okay, where do I want to take this when we talk about it? Because particularly a lot of these, when we talk about the issues related to anxiety, it's easy to throw buzzwords around though, like trauma and anxiety, and we sort of get stuck in this sort of speaking as if we're all using the same word, but as if we all mean it the same way. And I appreciate you calling that out, Tim, because anxiety, the way it's used in the world means everything. And you kind of anxiety and depression in the mental health world are the common cold symptoms, and so it can be the presence of anxiety can be related to so many different issues. And in some ways it's seen just sort of as an external symptom of kind of excessive worry, ruminating thoughts, kind of like Elizabeth's talking about your mind not being able to stay focused and mindful and right now, but worrying about the future or ruminating on what happened in the past. However, so I think a simple way to consider it is almost kind of on a spectrum where there's going to be normal worry, there's going to be normal fear, there's going to be normal amounts of like unsettledness, kind of concern. But as that passes a threshold into sort of areas where you feel like you're beginning to lose control, where you're unable to stay focused in the now, you're unable to calm yourself down, where it's as if sort of something is hijacking your thoughts, hijacking your physical and emotional reactions. That's where we start getting a little bit more clinically concerned, and we start talking about anxiety. But even that exists on kind of a continuum, as all of us experience anxiety and kind of concern and worry, and some of us will notice that cognitively, a little bit more kind of racing thoughts, or sort of certain types of ideas, or catastrophizing, or kind of like a what ifs that can just kind of be stuck ruminating in our heads. For others, we'll feel it physically, and that'll be like a churned stomach or a racing heart, and there'll be very somatic aspects to it. For others, that'll be all of those. And so it's, I think, recognizing kind of what symptoms are present in you, and that kind of the degree to which you're, one, aware of them, and then two, feel able to respond to them, and engage in kind of what we would call coping skills or behaviors, or kind of in some ways like little tools or tricks to help yourself kind of calm back and regain a focus on what's happening now, where am I at, and what do I want to do moving forward, and so that I can respond to what my body and my mind is saying, as opposed to it hijacking me and taking in different directions. And so when we say anxiety, yeah, it's very closely correlated with fear, with worry, with stress, kind of with a lot of other words. And as my mind thinks of like this Venn diagram where they all kind of overlap in different ways. Anxiety is kind of the more clinical term we would use to talk about kind of the symptoms of that. I don't know if there's easier, more kind of less verbose way to respond to that.
Yeah. So Kristin, let me throw this to you, because I may or may not have been on the receiving end of this. If somebody like one of your friends calls you and you can tell quickly, oh, this is anxiety, they're in the midst of it. What are just kind of the low-hanging fruit coping mechanisms that help us to get a hold of things? Like, what would you tell somebody if they called you on the phone and you realize, oh, this is anxiety? What would you tell them?
Well, in that scenario, you're talking about somebody that's on, as Paul's talking about, the spectrum, that's more on the concern worry spectrum rather than the clinical spectrum, right? Because if it's clinical, I think I handle it differently.
Either or. I mean, really, I would say if you could answer more in what the mainstream of what you think most people are dealing with right now, I guess.
Yeah. So mostly I think helping people actually figure out what they're feeling is helpful, because what ends up happening is you get ruminated in these conversations in your head, or you're concerned with your own somatic feelings, and you're unable to really think bigger picture about what your concern really is, or what you're really trying to feel, that's getting stuck sort of in this plateau of anxiety. And so I think if I'm speaking to a friend or a kid or a parent about, and I can feel their anxiety, which on the phone I'm feeling that through sort of maybe a heightened, like a quicker speaking, or a more emphatic speaking, or this sort of flustered feeling. And so then what I'm doing is trying to be a really calm presence for them, but also really get at what it is they're feeling. Are they afraid? Are they concerned? Are they worried? Are they anxious about what aspect of what's happening in their life? Is it about children? Is it about homeschool? Is it about loss of income? And I'm really trying to hone in on where their concern is so that we can talk about it.
And then, if someone's spinning out, what can they do to bring themselves back?
Do you want me to answer that, Mike? I think you had something to add. Do you want to add?
Well, I think this is good. I'll let you respond to that question, but
Okay. So there's a lot, I think it's different for everybody, but there's some kind of gold standards. You can, first of all, I think a conversation with a friend is really helpful. Being with somebody who is calm, trying to take some deep breaths all the way down to their belly, which might calm their nervous system. Movement, so taking a walk, sitting in a rocking chair, all of these things can bypass what's happening in their mind and get to a neurological calming that might be helpful.
If I could throw a couple things in there, kind of just differentiate between like what may be like a moment of like, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, like this anxiety just hit me. I can tell something's happening and I'm beginning to kind of spiral into this, like I'm getting more and more anxious just sitting here, versus overall my level of anxiety just sort of baseline in the background that is kind of that I deal with is higher. And I think all of us are experiencing the second. We're sort of like, yeah, we're all a little more anxious. We're all a little more tense. And you can think of this very much, I think, the way we typically talk about stress. The overall stress level of the average person right now has just gone way up, which means our ability to tolerate those moments or even simple things that come are going to increase our anxiety spikes in those moments right then and there. And so I think a lot of, I very much agree with everything Kristin just said, in the sense like when that begins to hit and you're kind of feeling like, oh no, kind of your thoughts start getting faster and faster and faster, and you can physiologically sometimes feel yourself tensing up or your heart beating faster, all those things. Yeah, you want to, I mean, if you're into mindfulness type things, be that deep breathing, doing something relaxing, something self-soothing, or doing something active to literally get the stress, kind of get it out of you. Those are all really important in the moment, as well as connecting with somebody so you kind of need to express it in some way, get it out of you, otherwise it stays there. But I would say that the other side of anxiety is that sort of background noise that's sort of gotten louder as all of us have been kind of in this stay-at-home order that I think, or what I forget, whatever the official term is for, but we're all kind of quarantined. And so recognizing that aspect, and there are other things of sort of like keeping a routine, and a lot of stuff actually, Tim, that you kind of touched on in your last video, sort of like to have a healthy rhythm to help normalize that and kind of help that background parts lower, so that we've got more, I mean, you can think of it as patience to deal with each other and to deal with life stresses. And so I just kind of quickly differentiate with sort of background anxiety from sort of momentary spikes that will, I think even just remembering like this will pass. You know, you're only going to stay heightened for so long. It will go back down, as opposed to what often happens is this sort of panic. What if I'm always going to be stuck like this? And you kind of feel like you're crawling out of your own skin when it starts reaching really higher levels.
So how do you spot this? Like, I mean, I can verbalize what's going on. I can talk to somebody. How do you spot this in kids and young adults?
Let me comment, if I could, a little bit more about some of the nuances and the anxieties, I think, and then I'll let others respond to the particular question you posed. Tim, I think it's a really good one. One of the ways that I think about it, and trying to get too jargony, is there's lots of kinds of anxiety, and it's easy to kind of lump them all together. We are kind of blurring two kinds of anxieties right now. One is often called neurotic anxiety. That means very little to most people, but they're kind of the everyday run-of-the-mill anxieties. If I have some sort of concern that may be on my mind, I'm not concerned that my life ends or something like that, that the world will end. So if I forget to pay my credit card, for instance, balance at the certain time, yeah, I might be kind of worried, did I pay it? I might have a penalty or something like that, but I don't feel like my life will end, hopefully. That's a neurotic anxiety, and I can kind of see it as things I avoid. Or if you have a paper to write, let's say that you're a teen or a high schooler, and it gives you attention to kind of fit this essay together, and you avoid it, a lot of avoidance. Compare that to an existential anxiety, which is a little different. In fact, it's a lot different. It's a fundamental sense that my life, my being, my freedoms are so encroached upon that they may no longer exist. And the reaction intensity is not, it's the same, but it's more intense, often described as angsty, right? But to a degree that's terrified. This is a kind of anxiety where I feel like I am somehow in jeopardy, and that could put people who are vulnerable into psychotic moments. I was talking with one woman, for instance, who believes the Illuminati created COVID-19. And what we see in these kinds of moments is this inability to explain something that fundamentally scares me. And then kind of related to it is a need to somehow locate it in the other political parties. And so there's like this hatred of certain entities, others. We see a lot, unfortunately, of hate crimes across the United States against people of Asian descent. And what we see is this location of this existential threat. We've seen this before in other things, whether, I won't get into the political part of it, but locating it in the other is a scary fundamental threat to me. We see this terror right now that I don't know who to blame. I can't locate it. And so they're trying to find that. When we find that happening, that's when people get really dangerous sometimes, when they're more vulnerable for aggression. The aggression is different. It's not just I'm nervous, I'm worried, I have ruminations or kind of thoughts running through my head. It's a sense of, I feel like I'm threatened. There's that kind of intensity to it. And that promotes a sense of destabilized paranoia, worries of the other, proneness to aggression, isolation, blame, projection, lots of fancy terms that mean you have to figure a way to explain this thing, because when it's contained, it somehow seems more manageable. If I know it's just in those people, it's easier for me for some reason, because they're now the scary thing, and I can avoid them or attack them or somehow ostracize them or what have you. That is blurring together with normal everyday frustrations, like, do I pay my rent? Don't I pay my rent? Can my business survive? Those are normal. I mean, not normal, but they're kind of like, I will survive if my rent isn't paid. It will be really hard. I have a lot of things to navigate. But then there's a sense of life and death also superimposed on it. And this is where we get into a new spot. Now, kids, I will let somebody else respond to that. I think it's a really good question, but maybe that's one way to kind of frame that's what's different. This is not just normal anxiety. It's normal anxiety mixed with something existential, threatening deeply to ourself and our freedom.
So before we move on to the kids thing, is there a point at which that moves over into trauma, or are those on different spectrums?
Well, I think fundamentally this is the moment where trauma happens, but potentially. Trauma in some ways is an assault on one's sense of self, one sense of me continuing. And that can look a lot of ways. Things happen to me that fundamentally alter my sense of who I am going forward. And right now, that may mean the composition of my family, who, if I have someone vulnerable medically or financially or some other ways, it's a threat to me. And if I cannot act in that moment to somehow thwart it, keep it at bay, that's traumatic. If I can't do anything to stop it, and I can't see COVID-19, and I don't know who has it, I'm powerless. And that powerlessness in the midst of something that feels like a danger to myself is where trauma is starting to bubble. And I think that has implications for how we parent and what we try to shield our kids from, who may be more vulnerable, but also people in our community psychologically and physically who may be vulnerable. I don't know, I saw other heads nodding. Other thoughts?
I think the thing I jump in there with, particularly, Tim, I mean, trauma originally was even just conceptualized as an anxiety disorder. That's the original idea of it, was actually this sort of extreme version of it. So thinking of it in that way is definitely not completely off the mark. Trauma's gotten a lot more nuanced since some of those initial formulations, but that is very much kind of in line, kind of with what Mike's saying. There's a lot more to go into there. And I think part of the thing with trauma is that it's not, realizing the trauma isn't so much just located in what happens to you, as far as also what's the subjective experience that you bring to it, and like kind of what meaning do you make of what you just went through, of what just happened. And so that's why the same incident can be traumatic, can have a traumatic response. And that's where we're actually looking at, like, what are the symptoms that come and what happens to the person afterwards in one person, and another person would be able to make meaning of it and kind of fit it into their sense of themselves and their life and be able to go on, not have the same level of external symptoms afterwards. And so absolutely, I think on a national level, I mean, at a global level, this is a trauma that we are experiencing. For some people, that's going to manifest itself in some of what we typically think of in sort of traumatic responses. For others, that won't necessarily get to that point, and for others, that will fade, and for others, that will be something like this could be a long-term thing. And one of the things we do know is that everybody responds differently. And so giving space for, even in the family, I think, even among people you know, that this is hitting everybody slightly differently, that this is affecting everyone differently. And I think in a moment I really do want to get into, like, the difference between kids and adults and different aged kids developmentally. And of course that's going to be different, but then even among same peers, among spouses, among friends, this is affecting all of us slightly differently. And the way we're going to then respond to that is going to be really different. So it's important that we give each other grace, give each other kind of patience, and allow for each of us to kind of have our ways of coping with this. And in that, I think individually, for us to begin to notice, how do I respond to something like this? What's my world? What's my way when that existential threat, when that fear of the unknown, and I feel completely powerless to stop it? I can wash my hands a million times a day, and I still don't know if I'm going to get this. Or how do I respond to that? What is my way of trying to help myself feel calm and feel safe? Because that's really what a lot of these symptoms, as we call them, are actually our ways of trying to cope, our ways of trying to make sense of it, and to protect ourselves. I don't want to dominate here, but I don't know if that helps a little bit where we're going.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe let's just walk through the age groups and start with like littles, toddler to elementary. What are we looking for as parents if that tips us off? Okay, something's cooking here. I need to tune in a different way.
I'll jump in, and I think others have a lot more to say about this. There are some resources Tim and others we have shared, and we can do that. They have some screeners in it for even parents to kind of thumb through. But one thing is you'll see with littler kids is they'll be somatic. It'll be in their bodies. Their story is in their bodies. That's where the theater of the anxiety plays out. Stomach aches, headaches, the sense of avoidance, not wanting to do things, feeling unwell, avoiding. I think you'll see it more in that than in their ruminations. They may be less inclined or able to put it into words, but certainly.
So they're not saying I'm really worried. They're saying my tummy hurts.
My tummy hurts. Yep, okay. My tummy hurts. I have a headache. I don't feel good. And it's nebulous. It's kind of vague. It's like, well, what's wrong? What feels bad? And it's terrifying, especially in this time. We're like, what does that mean? Which only kind of is gasoline to flame, by the way. So, but poker face. This is time for poker face to play out. Like, oh, be curious. But even if you're scared, because what this is their kind of theater of explaining in their own ways what's happening. These are physiological kind of body manifestations of anxiety. And because of maybe some of the limitations in their own development, this is the way that they're going to tell that story. And we need to have the ears to hear it. And so experience that as their anxiety. Little kids, I'm talking about elementary and younger, especially early elementary, by and large. Developmentally, that can vary. There's no age, but yes. Other thoughts about others? I know others have better thoughts too.
One thing that comes to mind is, Mike, you were talking about just the feeling of maybe sick or unwell. Also, I think heightened irritation or impatience, or maybe quicker to have a tantrum, or quicker to hit their sibling, quicker to say no to the parent. I think all of those things are prompts that the child is really trying to deal with and think about in a developmentally appropriate way. All of the uncertainty and the feelings of their parents and sort of the temperature of the house.
I would add in there, just it's important to remember how kids don't have the capabilities to express everything the way the parents do. And I think obviously when we're calmly sitting down reflecting on that, it's like, oh yeah, of course not. But then when your kid's screaming and you're like, what's wrong? You want them to verbalize what's going on because you don't have another way to get to it. But kids often are sort of the thermometers for what's the stress level in the house. And so they're going to be expressing what you may not be expressing and what may be going on an implicit level among other members of the house. And so staying attuned to that is going to be really important. They also, because kind of as Kristin and Mike have said, they have fewer ways of making meaning of it, of expressing things. The frustration when working with kids is that almost all of their issues tend to look the same. They get angry about everything, be that whether they're depressed or they're anxious or they're sad or frustrated, whatever it may be. And so all of their symptoms, whatever you may call it, will sometimes look the same because they don't have as many ways of making sense of it, of expressing what's going on internally. And so as a parent, I think really what you want to take away from this is pay attention to your kids, notice for it, but try to maintain in yourself that sense that you can be this calming presence. You can help them understand this is what they're feeling because they don't have the life experience to know, oh yeah, hey, this is some background anxiety that's increased a little bit in me. And that's why my tummy is beginning to tingle in this way. They don't have that. They can't articulate it. And they actually kind of require you as a parent to be this calming presence with them, to say, yeah, I'm feeling anxious too, and this is how we deal with that, and this is what we're going to do with it, and to kind of be this way of making meaning of these physical sensations that they're going through, and then of these otherwise emotional reactions that they're having. So giving them grace, recognizing, I think as parents, it's easy to see their anger as sort of everything is defiance, and then particularly when we are the ones who are also stressed, we see things as sort of like aggressive against us. We're kind of already in a somewhat defensive posture because of our own anxiety. And so we can tend to interpret children's kind of saying no, or angry, lashing out, like Kristin was talking about, hitting a sibling, as like, well, you're just being a bad kid right now. You're just acting up. And so I try to talk to parents a lot about, one, that word just be careful when you notice yourself saying the word just, because you're reducing something. But then also to listen for what else may be going on. And is this maybe more, less of a defiance boundary testing issue and more of something related to their own emotional world and kind of their own lack of skills in having another way to understand, metabolize, contain, those are fun, fancy words we use for making sense of what they're going through and what they're experiencing, both in themselves, but then also in the family system around them.
Yeah, let's jump up an age group here. And Cole, you may want to jump in with this part too. So what are we looking for in adolescents and teenagers?
More avoidance, more distractibility. It will mimic something that kind of looks like ADHD, attention deficit stuff, sense of poor focus, distractibility, withdrawal maybe, like they just want to sit in front of a screen of one kind or another and just sort of numb out. It might look like, I hear parents call this laziness sometimes. Quite actually, it's their finest effort to soothe what feels otherwise unsoothed inside, overwhelmed inside, but hidden behind a kind of maybe checked out or frustrated or kind of temperamental, irritable exterior, in my observation. I think we see it move from the body primarily into this sort of social kind of mood area. I'm oversimplifying it for sure. But it's a little more complex than this tummy ache and a headache. It's a sense of just, I don't care. I don't care, whatever. I mean, almost an indifference to the pandemic would be a sign of trauma, actually, rather than an actual indifference. It's a sense of it's too much and I just cannot stare at the sun any longer. So I'm just not going to. And that kind of apathy is probably one attempt to kind of grade or kind of slow down the internal turmoil, which can be really frustrating when it seems like you don't care, like this is too big not to care, that kind of thing.
So you're mentioning it was trauma. My big question is really around the language, because I think what you described there is actually just kind of teenagers all the time. So like I've always been I've wondered when we say that, what does trauma, I guess, then mean if a lot of times a lot of teenagers, that's how they kind of function around every obstacle or every kind of pervasive anxiety that's going on. How do we differentiate that for them when a lot of times they associate anxiety, trauma, bad, all bad things. So how do we talk about that when it's everything from COVID to my teacher sucks?
Right. Great question. I think Elizabeth, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you commented on maybe a sociological conversation about this generation of teens that may be currently going through. This is a group that somehow was present and aware of, to some degree, the financial crisis a decade ago. I mean, this is a group that has lived through a lot of insecurity in different forms, depending on their family situation. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think that has had implications. In terms of it, I would say degree and timing. If it's changed, if it seems more intense, that the pull for those things is more kind of common and more obstinate, then I would say that this is one of the ways that they're coping. I think this is a generation that has suffered actually quite a lot of trauma, but in a way that seems a lot less clear. It's not like one thing, death by 1,000 cuts kind of feel. and they don't have the internal resources by and large to know how to cope with it. We see this sociologically in many other conversations, from violence at schools and bullying and other things too. So I won't go that far to say this is a uniquely traumatized group, but I think this is a group that's more vulnerable than what we're used to maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I think, Cole, to answer your question more though, if you see as a parent this intensify, that is their primary way to deal with it. And it feels like they're a little out of character, more than they're usually. To Paul's point earlier, grace, because this is their way of trying to shift it down. I don't know if other thoughts about this, even symptoms in a teen or kind of later childhood kind of view.
One thing that I would add to that is just this concept of holding discomfort, and how it seems as if the age group that I work in, they struggle to hold discomfort, and teaching people that we can hold discomfort and we can survive is kind of something. We do a little icebreaker where I have them hold some ice, and it starts to drip and it's painful and they don't like it and they want to get rid of it. And so I say, okay, you can throw that away, but if I were to give you $1,000 to hold that until it melts completely, would you be able to hold that discomfort? And it's just a little icebreaker that we do, literally using ice. And so it's kind of just a mind concept of helping them understand that you really can survive holding discomfort. And you can grow in resilience and you can grow in strength. And I think it says we have hope in you and we believe in you. And I think that is a lot what high school and college kids need to hear too, that yes, we talk a lot about how worried we are in terms of their lack of capacity for certain things, but we need to also be balancing that by saying, you know, I believe in you, you are strong, you are resilient, and this is how I see this in you. And kind of helping them know that they're building muscles when they hold this discomfort well. So anyway, that's kind of adding on to what Mike said.
Yeah, is it okay if I ask another question? Okay, so so talking a lot with students and parents a lot of times, I'm curious, is the goal of what this conversation, like what we're trying to do, what we're trying to help kids see, attain, become, I don't know the word. Because often as I'm talking to parents and kids, what I find is they have this idea or this dream or this vision of their child without anxiety and without these problems. And they're looking for ways for them to navigate around it, or to like not feel it, or for it to go away. And I'm curious as to what you guys would say, or I'm sorry, what you all would say, is kind of what we're hoping. What is the vision you see when you see a student or a patient who is going through trauma or anxiety? How do you, and Elizabeth said this a little bit, but like, how do you envision that for that person? And what is the pathway through a lot of these traumas, a lot of this anxiety, and how do we in some way talk about it so that, again, as I was saying, parents and kids both, they hear these words and they just like lump them in bad. Like they just throw everything into this bucket of like, I shouldn't not be feeling this. This is all terrible, blah, blah, blah. I'm horrible. And it's so hard to help them piece out like what this is and why this is actually maybe good for you and what's going on here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, Cole, that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's quite a few things, in that question that I think would be good to jump on. One of the first ones that I think I was thinking about just as the others were talking is that, yeah, we also tend to split during these times in the sense of like, we put the world into good and bad categories. And that becomes a way of making sense of it. Oh, this is a good thing and this is a bad thing. I want to feel good. I don't want to feel stressed. I want to feel happy. I don't want to feel scared. And I think what I hear you saying in there is that teens often, and which makes total sense, they want to like, okay, what should I be doing? What should I not be doing? What should I be feeling? And what should I not be feeling? To be slightly crass, there's the old joke, and I think it was was it Ellis who used to say, don't shit all over yourself. In this idea where, and we tend to do this like I should. And what we miss in that simplistic good, bad is we miss this question of, but what's that doing for you? And I think that there's this kind of way of understanding these anxious reactions, as I think this is part of what Mike was getting at, is like, that's your way of trying to deal with this. Like, it is a survival technique. It's a way of dealing with something that feels too much for me. I'm going to check out because this is too much for me. Or as Elizabeth was saying, I can't handle this level of discomfort. I will be overwhelmed by this. This is more than I can handle. So I need a break. And to be frank, we all do. There are points at which we all need a break. You need to rest. You need to be able to breathe. And that by itself is not a bad thing. The fact that, you took an evening and you binged Netflix for a little bit doesn't mean that you are failing at quarantine. Doesn't, the fact that you decided to rest doesn't mean that. We can't be in a state of constant arousal, or sort of constantly feeling fear and anxiety. However, I think, and this is where we start noticing, and this is kind of some of the nuance of becoming a clinician, is noticing when is that becoming something where that's kind of my only go-to, and where I become so accustomed to, oh, I'm nervous, okay, I'm checking out, to where this just becomes like this default slip into, I'm checking out, I'm going to be on my phone, I'm going to be on a screen, I can't feel this. And so we become so sensitive to any kind of anxious feeling or discomfort that we go into this, I'm not here anymore. I'm gonna lean towards this. And I think any kind of coping mechanism or way of dealing with bad feelings that's our only coping mechanism actually can become problematic. As you can get people who are almost, we might almost begin to use words like addicted to working out. Exercise is great, but working out when that's your only way of coping, that can become problematic. The same thing with people who become kind of obsessive and compulsive about hand washing. Yes, we should all wash our hands, as we're all learning that now. But if you're washing your hands so many times that your hands are beginning raw and bleeding, that's becoming too much of a thing you're leaning on to try to, it's becoming more than it needs to. And I think there's an element of putting too many eggs in one basket. You're relying too much on one gear. I can get lost in my metaphors here. But this idea of rigidity there, where you don't have the flexibility to sometimes feel it and kind of almost push yourself and experience it and then check out. Because the idea of checking out to rest actually is that you come back, because it doesn't go away when you check out. And that's why it becomes harder for teens. If they're constantly on their phones and checking out, then they're never dealing with those feelings that are then getting stored kind of physically or kind of in other ways that it kind of stays up there. And so they can get overwhelmed by them pretty quickly. So I think I went all over the place with that response, but the idea.
Let me jump in and ask you then. So especially I'm thinking with teenagers. So what are we trying to do then, Paul? Like, are we trying to engage them in conversation about this, or is it better to go shoot baskets? Like, are we trying to get them to let down their defenses and share? Like, what's the end game, or what's the goal?
Yeah, I think my quick annoying professor response would be, it depends. But I think the other more nuanced response is that we're actually trying to give them the capacity for more. We're trying to help them be able to do more, and we're trying to help them be more aware of why. So sometimes that means let's go shoot some baskets, and let's kind of understand, because we do need physically to get some time off, and relating to people in a non-threatening, non-anxious way is going to be helpful. And at other times, it's maybe I'm going to push you for a conversation, and I will respect that you don't want to talk about it now, but I'll offer this opportunity that we can do this. In doing so, I'm just trying to implicitly communicate we can handle the feelings that are going to come up by directly talking about this. And you'll see this come up in kind of pre-pandemic times around issues related to how adults will often use euphemisms around certain taboo topics like death and sex, and what we do when we're constantly using these euphemisms around them is that we communicate, I can't actually talk about this directly, and so I'm never going to. And so with the pandemic, I think what we want to be able to do is communicate, be able to have those conversations to say, I can talk to you about this, I can hold the anxiety for a little bit too, but we also don't need to constantly be in there. And I think a danger for parents is that in trying to make us feel calm, what we end up doing is kind of putting that on everybody else, and we try to run around the house saying, stop feeling anxious, and running around playing whack-a-mole with everybody else's feelings, when what we actually haven't done is taken any time to recognize our own feelings. And so I think if the parent, if you're being able to respond to your own anxiety, then you have then you're offering that freedom to your teen, or to your spouse, or to whoever else may be, for them to respond their way. I don't know, I'm talking a lot here, so I'm gonna pause and let someone else take over for a bit.
Yeah, one of the other things that comes to my mind is that teenagers tend to be, just developmentally, it's appropriate, but they tend to be more egocentric. So they're stuck in their own world. And so I think one of the things that's really helpful as adults, whether it be clinicians or helping them find safe people to talk to, is I think giving them some perspective, a broader perspective of what they're dealing with. So Cole, as you're talking about the average kid who's not in a pandemic and they're feeling all of this stress and anxiety, having an adult say, it's going to be okay. If you get an F on a test, you're going to survive, right? You're going to be okay. And, not patronizing them, but also being able to really put this one experience that feels so vital and important to them in a long, lifespan is really helpful, I think, for these kids. But also letting them know that what they're feeling is okay, and that feelings aren't a bad thing. And if they're stressed and worried, it's okay. Know that as the adult, you're not afraid of that. You're not going to buckle because they told you that. I think another thing that's really helpful is to let your children of any age know who the safe adults are to talk to, because sometimes they don't want to have a conversation with the parent. So letting them know that, they can talk to these 5 people that you trust as adults is, I think, really helpful for kids and adults, teens and kind of young adults.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay. One thing I wanted to point out, because I think I'm going to try to remember this. Elizabeth was talking about resiliency, and that word for me, and basically a lot in my own upbringing, resiliency has been be tough and be strong, be tough. And I've been trying to, as Elizabeth talked about resiliency, it's at the different imagination for what it is for me. So Paul said that for students, the ability to handle more, would that be in some way a way of talking about resiliency that is outside of my own upbringing, outside of just like be tough, be strong, just power through? Is that like the ability to, is that kind of what you're talking about, Elizabeth, like the ability to handle more?
Yeah, I think so. I hadn't actually thought of it in words like that, but I like that a lot. Basically resilience, the definition is, you can come back when everything in your life tells you to shut down. And so that doesn't happen overnight. That happens by daily practice. And so what I think is so important for parents of college kids right now is to help them problem solve. As they problem solve, they build resilience. And then to be able to make that part of their life story. Do you remember the time in April of 2020 that you couldn't do this, and then you've worked it out, and that becomes part of their resilient story, is problem solving. It's really, to me, resilience is one baby step on top of another, of saying, oh yeah, I remember I was able to do that. I did figure that, whatever it is. And this is an amazing, what I would encourage all parents to do is tell stories. If you've lived long enough, you've got stories to tell your kids. And I think when you tell them stories of resilience, especially in your life or your grandparents' life or your parents' life, I think it just starts planting that idea that I can be resilient. I can hold these difficult emotions. And so things like that, I think are important, but I don't see resilience as what you're saying, like I'm super strong and nothing affects me. I see it as daily practice that builds on each other, and it gives you strength, because all of us are going to face something again. This isn't the end. We've got a whole lot more ahead of us. That's called life. one thing we haven't really talked about, and I did want to talk about today, was the grief that our kids are experiencing, and how we could help them with that. And I can't tell you how many things were suddenly taken out of my college kids' lives. And it's overwhelming, especially if they were seniors. And so I'd like others to talk about this too, as far as grief and how we can help our kids during this time. And Cole, Brian's already had one of the teens reach out to him and say, I really wanted to hear Cole's word for me. I think everyone's familiar that Cole gives every senior a word at the end. And he was heartbroken, and he told Brian that. And that's just an example of all the small little griefs that keep building on. And so I'd just be curious as to what you guys think we should do in terms of helping our kids with grief. So now I'm asking the questions, Tim, sorry.
I think it's a great point, Elizabeth, particularly kind of viewing it also through the grief lens can help give, even just using that word with people, with teens and with those going through it, to help them realize, oh, I am grieving, that there's a loss. It's not just like, and I think using words like trauma sometimes, the words we use, the metaphors, they mean different things, and they imply different things in different categories of our heads for understanding it. And saying, no, this is a loss, this is a grief. You weren't having the graduation ceremony. You weren't getting to play in you're not able to run in your last track meet, or whatever it was that they've lost. And allowing the space to mourn that and to be sad for that. With that, and I think sometimes the hard part for parents there, for those helping, is that if that's going to be triggering my own loss, I may try to shut you up, because if I'm not ready to feel what it means for me to not have been able to be there with my child on their graduation or whatever it is, then that I'm not going to be able to handle that. And so I think allowing ourselves to grieve that part, and even modeling that for teens, is going to be really important. And for each other, I think this is something, obviously teens are losing quite a bit, and as you've mentioned, particularly seniors, but the whole world is losing. And then obviously as this pandemic picks up and those who with illnesses get kind of become more and more of us have connections to people who are losing or who are ill, that's also going to increase. I think to tie this in even then, Cole, with what you were saying about like what it means to be tough, kind of for those of us who are a little bit older, I would push back on what the idea of toughness was. Actually very shallow, slim toughness. And so as I say, be able to experience more, that idea of toughness usually means pretend you don't feel sad. Pretend you don't feel anything I'm going to label weak. Pretend it's not there. Don't let yourself feel. So it's actually not, that idea of resilient actually is a very fragile one, because it doesn't know how to comprehend when there is real loss, when there is real sadness, without denying it, without splitting it off, pretending it's not there. And so what we want to be doing is not creating these sort of Marlboro Man type responses in people, but more someone who has the capacity to cry, at the same time has the capacity to move on and problem solve, and to recognize that life will continue, and to re-engage people. And that's why I think there's the capacity for more. It's not, I'm always this stoic, strong figure. No, I have the capacity to feel my feels. And I think grief is one of those that I would argue, particularly in our society and kind of this more patriarchal society, that males are told we're not supposed to have to feel that, to express that that's a sign of weakness. And I think allowing the space for that, and then modeling what that looks like, is really important at this time.
I think those are really good points. And I want to go back to what you said and think through some of the things you mentioned, Cole. There was this old wrestler myth from Greek mythology of the strongest wrestler ever. And he carried around a little calf with him. And every day he lifted the calf above his head. And as he grew, the calf grew, and he kept doing it. And by the time he became a wrestler, he was the strongest, most prolific wrestler ever. The implications for resilience are many. One is to see it as a muscle, not a fortitude or kind of disposition that you're born with. I think Paul's and others' positions, Elizabeth too, it's a developmental thing. it's worked out, it's built up, it's strengthened. And I think prayers of take this from me versus strengthen my back is kind of the capturing the tension between these two. A lot of the kids these days, and people too, many of us, feel like this is too much, just take it from me, right? Versus this sort of desire to continue to grow into it, even if it's too hard today, and I need a rest day, I need a cheat day from the gym. So I think seeing it in that metaphor may be a better way to kind of conceptualize resilience as a kind of developmental process. But I think, Tim, you had asked a question earlier. It's really been kind of on my mind about, do I go shoot hoops or what do I do? Practical stuff is really thinking about that. It depends, right? That's a good professor answer. Thanks, Paul. But in my mind, it does seem to make sense. It presents in its weird kind of meta way a sense of not like the world is not ending. The existential threat to our existence is sort of lost in the normalcy of a game of basketball, a poor game, a walk. I live by interestingly enough, a cemetery, and we'll walk around in the cemetery. But this sort of normal kind of pattern of movement is funny enough. It kind of, in my experience and in my opinion, it decreases the sense of defensiveness, like all of it's about to end. And in that way, it opens up possibilities then of conversations while playing basketball, while on a walk, while at board game. And you don't force those conversations necessarily. They come up organically, often be listened for that moment. And so this sort of dual thing, it's a meta message, which is to say, like, we are going to get through this, which is why we can sort of have the luxury of basketball or a walk or whatever, barbecue in the back porch or something. That's one thought around it. In terms of with kids and the grief, and I think Elizabeth, I think this is a really profound point. I see this with my students as well. The grief, there aren't ceremonies. Ceremonies and the point of ceremony is now compromised. Birthdays, funerals, and without this graduation or whatever else may be that ceremony of a senior night or you're speaking over their life, the moment is somehow lost and there's an incompleteness. And I think as a community, we have to put our minds together how to reimagine the ceremonies right now. And that means a ceremony that commemorates this loss. Examples that come out of some of the interesting resources, and again, I'll share those with you all, is creating like a time capsule, like a letter to yourself for the future. Like, here is April, whatever, I'm disoriented from time, so I went to the day, it's Palm Sunday, and here's where I'm at. And it's like this sort of like somehow a ceremonial kind of moment to kind of mark in stone what is happening right now. It feels important. I think, Elizabeth, you were talking about coming back to what was April 2020 like, is a feeling of a ceremonial kind of end. And I think we have to be creative and imagine new ceremonies to grieve. Else, if we just kind of imagine like, well, you didn't graduate, didn't walk, but you got the paper, that feels super incomplete, like not going to a funeral or being present for a birth as a parent. These are important moments. So just a thought.
I wonder if you guys could maybe think of it in terms of pitfalls. What are the things we want to avoid as parents? And I think I'm interested in the whole spectrum of age groups.
The first thing that comes to my mind is forcing conversation. And I'm specifically thinking about teens right now, but I think it's true for all kids. You sort of let them lead, right? So you're meeting them where they are. And as a parent, that seems more difficult because you don't get to do it on your own time. But I think that a watchful parent who's really paying attention to their children can see these moments of need. And that's when the conversation comes, rather than, hey, let's force this conversation. Because the older they get, as you know, when you're trying to force a conversation with a teen, they're going to shut down or be angry or say something that's going to be really hurtful to you. And then you as the parent are triggered. And now we've just got this situation where we're both feeling away, right? When we were trying to have this great conversation. So I think really paying attention to the child's lead and helping them have the conversation when they're ready.
It makes me think of how, I don't even know who taught me this, but if I do need to have a more intentional conversation with my kids or young kids, it's probably more likely to happen in the car, or when I don't have to do a ton of eye contact, it's like too intense. But if we're working shoulder to shoulder, kind of more than face to face, I think I usually have a better shot at actually getting them to say what they think. What other pitfalls are there, though?
Several. I mean, it depends developmentally. One would be anxiety, your own anxiety as a parent, for instance. A quick anecdote. World War II, the Nazis, Luftwaffe, are bombing London and other cities. This is kind of where mere Christianity comes out of and all these things. And it's a war crime. They're bombing civilians who don't know it's coming, and then they get this alarm in the middle of the night, and they don't know if they're going to be attacked. And they all run under the cover of dark into tunnels, whether that's the actual subway or whatever else, and they're terrified. And they live this way for some time, for years. And they study, the researchers came after World War II and studied the kids who grew up under this paradigm of like constantly unpredictable threat. And what they find is that there were two primary groups. One group is the parents who could not maintain a composure in the midst of all the uncertainty. And by the way, it was scary to everybody, but they lost it. And what happens, these kids grow up later and they feel terrified. They experience those moments as traumatic. They experience them as too much, terrible. And there was another group, the other group, which the parents somehow had a sense of, we are going to get through this. We're going to maintain something. And they look back on it and they can remember it, but they don't feel terrified. There's something, we lived through it. We got through it. It was hard. I say that to say the research is pretty clear, and I'm oversimplifying it, but the research is clear that is, as a parent, your primary job is to somehow be composed enough to compose your kid. Doesn't mean you have to be all the way. That's why you need other people in your life. So get other people in your lives. But for just this moment, you have to have enough of a poker face and a composure and a posture of being open to this, that your kids aren't somehow managing your anxiety. Littler kids especially, but that doesn't go away as they get older, take their cues of this is terrifying from the parents. If my 2-year-old falls down, he looks up at me sometimes to sort of gauge and make sense of, comprehend whether this moment was painful, traumatic, too much, and how I respond somehow forms his meaning of this. If I say timber, he kind of gets up and runs around and, well, you've seen this. But if I kind of overreact, then he experiences terrible. If in this moment we cannot as parents somehow find the opportunities in it, a new rhythm, slow pace that kind of has present possibilities, that there's something more to come, and hope that, and be that way with our kids, then our kids are going to experience this sometimes, especially littler kids, as terrible. They're going to focus on all the things they lost, which there's certainly loss for everybody, but it's going to come across as this huge, painful, awful thing, where it could be also this moment where this is the time we made crafts and we hand sewed masks for people and we wrote letters and we did these things, and it can have multiple meanings. Now I'm rambling. My thought would be too much focus on the loss and too little management of one's own anxiety. That's too big one.
It makes me think of Edwin Friedman. Yeah, I was a family systems therapist, but also wrote a book on leadership that I like. He talks about the non-anxious presence, and that some of what that requires is the ability to name the anxiety of the system, and you have to name it accurately. Like it can't be a put-up job. You have to be telling the truth, and you have to have a realistic assessment of what's happening. You have to name it accurately, but then you don't participate in it. And so he calls them self-differentiated leaders, that I can differentiate my sense of self from the anxiety of this anxious system. And I may not be able to change the anxiety of the anxious system, but I don't have to participate in it. And what that allows us to do in a place of leadership, and I think this goes for parents as well, is then we can genuinely say why we're not afraid of what's happening. I don't want this to happen, and I'm naming it accurately, and this really sucks. But I can say I'm not afraid. I'm not overwhelmed by this, and do those things like confidence building. I'm going to get through it. But if we can't differentiate, if we're overly participating in the anxiety, or perhaps even leveraging it for our own psychological needs or emotional needs, then we're just passing it on to the folks around us.
Yeah, I think kind of to build on that, Tim, and also maybe I'll just sort of the counterpoint on Mike's, because I completely agree with what Mike said, but to sort of keep that from being this giant should on parents or on us of like, I guess I need to be this perfect person, is deal with reality. And I think that's this to kind of bring us back even to what Elizabeth was saying right in the beginning of like, let's deal with now and let's deal with what's going on right now. And that means let's be honest about what you're feeling in that moment. And so part of dealing with reality is like, yeah, you know what? I got a little nervous there. I got scared. I was afraid, but I'm able to notice that. I'm able to experience that. And as you're talking about this, like differentiate myself, that doesn't have to overwhelm me. But I can still feel that, and I'm going to feel that. And so this is not a denial of everything's fine. Let's go shoot hoops. Because that could be done in a very sort of dismissing way that's like, no, don't feel bad. We're going to shoot hoops and we're going to pretend. We're just going to pretend. And a lot of families that have trauma in them, that's this way of coping, is this denial, this pretend. And that is not what we're advocating. But it's in a sense of we can have both, that we can still have a sense of normality, that we can talk about what's going to happen. We have the capacity to shoot hoops in this and to feel a sense of normal and to still connect with each other in ways we used to, in some ways that are going to be different, but we're able to continue on. And so I would just put that in that parents don't hear that in a sense of like, I guess I need to be perfect, otherwise my kids are ruined. No, you need to, what I would encourage is to help yourself deal with reality. The age old, for those of you that have flown, put the oxygen mask on yourself, and then you can put it on your children, because otherwise you're the panicked person throwing oxygen masks and beating them with them. And so, yeah, if you're not able to find that rhythm in yourself, that calmness in yourself, that stability, and that's where I think the routines like tuning into church, by connecting to prayers, by ourselves finding those rhythms, we'll be able to be more of that presence for others. But yeah, just so that people don't hear that in this shameful, I guess now this is what I need to do sort of thing.
I think for my experience with students is they talk often, this is funny, but I think what I find most often with kids whose parents care a lot about them, which is every parent, but like parents who are, reading and really trying, that often they will say exactly what's going on. Like, my parents got a divorce or whatever situation. And then they will say, I am upset. I'm feeling grief about this. I have anxiety about this, and blah, 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 blah. And then we'll get to a point in a conversation where you kind of, and I hate to say should, because I know, Paul, you said not to do this, but I kind of wonder for them, what do they think they should be feeling then, that their parents broke down, or their family broke down, and they'll kind of pause, and for whatever reason, they've never been allowed permission to necessarily feel the feeling that they're feeling. and it's always been like, well, this is a problem. Let's figure out how to get through this. And I don't think that's necessarily parents' fault. I think a lot of times kids even just perceive that. I think that's just kind of how they interpret the signals they're getting. But yeah, I appreciate a lot of what you said. Like, I just think that a lot of parents and a lot of kids, sometimes there just has to be a space where we should be feeling really stressed out and sad and grief about what's happened to graduation. But there is I don't know any other response in some way that eventually are all going to eventually get to, but this is pretty terrible.
It's a sense, instead of what should I be feeling, it's what am I feeling? Like, let's feel what is. Let's acknowledge and accept what is. Let's have the capacity, and go back to the same words before. Let's have the capacity for what is. And I think, but with that, and very much on that side of Mike, you're not going to be able to do that if you as a parent aren't able to become that calming, that non-anxious presence yourself. And so you've got to be able to focus on yourself. It's that sort of, I remember talking to a youth pastor friend a while back who was like, well, how do I get my kids to start reading their Bible more? I'm like, you're not going to do that if the parents aren't reading their Bible more. Just like those sorts of things, it's kind of simplify it in some ways. But if you I think, take on the idea of modeling, recognize more than a lecturer as a parent, you're a modeler. You are going to be modeling how to get through this. And that's going to be more of the thing. So, and again, just to bring it back, let's deal with what is, let's deal with reality.
To me, that is the joy, though, to deal with what is and deal with it. And then as time goes on, you reflect back, you had capacity to deal with it. I mean, I kind of keep harping on that, but I do feel like this is a time, such an unusual time, where their parents are going to see they're more resilient, and their life story is forever dictated by part of this. And so to me, a family can intentionally work during this time to teach us how to be stronger people in terms of holding discomfort and making this part of our life story, but it wasn't a story that defeated us to nothing. So.
And it wasn't an individual story. I think that's important too, right? It's a communal story. We're all experiencing it together, and we're all experiencing our own losses and our own fears and our own worries, and also our own hope for the future, right? That's the other thing is, I think some parents pivot too quickly to let's not feel it, and some parents pivot too quickly to let's feel it all the time. And so I think it's really important to understand which you are as a parent, and to really try and walk the middle line there, so that you're not making your child feel more than they should or want to. You know, it's okay to laugh sometimes too, not just grieve, you know, and I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, it's like there's a fine line between boundaries and avoidance, and you got to know which one you tend toward and make sure you're not falling into that familiar ditch. Kristin, you mentioned something too that I think is important, is how powerful humor and laughter is in times of grief and times of heightened anxiety. Sharing memes, finding hilarious Jack Black clips on TikTok, and just something to laugh about, you know, it can be a pretty powerful thing too. But there are other kind of, I mean, stress reliever things, or maybe bonding things that we can do when in isolation or whatever this period is.
One of the things that was coming to mind as we've been having this conversation is the other thing that's really specific to teenagers is that this sort of egocentricity, but also this I need my friends, right? Their friends are really important to them. And so this is so isolating for them because they're not going to school, they're not going to sports, they're not going to church and actually being with their friends. And so one of the things that is coming to mind here is thinking about how you can create spaces where your teens can still be friends with their friends, right? So maybe that's allowing them a little more screen time so they can actually talk to their friends over Xbox or PlayStation or whatever, right? But maybe while they're doing that, checking in with them, like, are you actually talking to your friends? Are you actually thinking about how they're doing, right? You're not just talking about the game you're playing. And so maybe meeting them where they are, but helping them go a little bit deeper. And that's sort of widening this window of resiliency that we're talking about too.
Great idea. I've heard of families doing things like trying to see this as an opportunity to kind of mimic Chopped, you know, that TV show where you get like the mystery basket, going through the pantry and figuring out ways to cook with their family with ingredients that might otherwise not seem to go together, and making it kind of an experience of kind of realizing how privileged they are, how much they have, but being creative with it. And it kind of, it's a participatory thing. You know, obviously face masks, I mentioned already, people sending these to hospitals, writing letters to first responders. I've heard of people calling up assisted living homes and saying, hey, is there a person there who would be cool to talk with me in different ways, because these are people who are very, very vulnerable, and even more than maybe the rest of, or the majority of us. But there's small rhythms. Start building something now that won't be beautiful for some time. Plant a garden, paint a room that you've been meaning to paint, because you know when it's done in 3 weeks, it will be kind of this memento of a beautiful thing that came out of work. There's no shortage of opportunities. Paint, write, read a book that you haven't read in a long time. I'm a book guy, so I like that kind of idea. But do things that take time, and expect they take time and their work. But know that the payoff in the future keeps you in expectancy of something productive, and you have something you're working for, and not just sort of waiting for. You know.
I love that, Mike. I think that's such a hands-on thing. One little thing I wanted to say to parents of college students specifically is they're not high school kids, they're emerging adults right now, and they've been on their own for a little while. They've been doing their own laundry, they've been doing all of that. So instead of trying to tweak them since they've returned home, I think it might be an amazing time to see what values your college student has developed, and listening and trying to enter conversations that they're interested in, as instead of seeing it as a time of, well, they're not really doing the laundry the way I taught them, now's the time I'm going to tweak that with them, but instead kind of starting to view them through that new lens where you give less and you listen more. I think it might be positive for college kids, because I think a lot of college kids were feeling just a little bit suffocated when they went home. And so it might be kind of something to stop and think back. And that might just be a little bit of advice I'm giving to college parents right now.
That's great. Elizabeth, what else are you hearing from college age students? How are they doing? What are they wrestling with?
Yeah, well, first of all, they had to learn how to do online school really fast. And you would think that they were so, techie kind of kids, it wouldn't be a big deal, but it was a big deal. And there's a lot of anxiety around, again, internet capacity. We're finding out that we were surprised at how many people are limited. There is definitely, if you had money or if you didn't have money, that's definitely coming through right now during this time. And so maybe when you were in college, maybe it was kind of all even, you were all living in the same type of dorm and all of that, but now it's not even. And so we're kind of hearing some stories of that. We're also hearing stories of kids that couldn't go to their original home and are now living with other people, and how hard that is to live with a whole other family that you weren't expecting to live with. So we're hearing some stuff like that. And then some of our kids are like, you know what, I'm home, I've got a good family, my stress level is actually reduced, which is great if that is wonderful. So we're kind of hearing the whole gamut of things. My hope is that that parents, here's what I've been doing videos to the students, and I've been saying, my hope is that you live into your values while you're home, and so that you don't live every day in frustration and anger, but you say, 5 years from now, when I look back on this, I want to say this was the type of person I was during one of the worst times of my life. And so trying to give them that big picture view, and that's kind of what our goal's been with sending out videos and stuff to them. But I miss those kids a lot, actually.
Yeah, I bet you do. Cole, what are you hearing from teenagers?
Much like what Elizabeth was saying, it's kind of all over the board. It depends on where they're at and what's going on. A lot of teenagers, most of the kids that have the ability to kind of, zone out do. And so I haven't heard too much from them. In fact, it's kind of weird. If I haven't heard anything, usually that is a sign of something, that's just, I've not heard anything. And so from the other end, for our particular context, some of our kids don't have the resources that some of our other kids do. And it's been very jarring, actually, for a good part of our youth group where they just, school ending, school was as much as they complained about it, it was a place where they hang out with their friends, they would get a meal, they'd hang out. And a lot of our kids it's not just that they're gone, they're not showing up, like they're radio silent. And for me personally, it's actually really, really difficult. So I hope they're all right. But yeah, I don't know. Kids are all over the place. So it's hard to really lock in on a way kids are responding. So
yeah. Any last thoughts before we go? This has been really good. Anything that we missed you want to make sure we hear?
I just want to say something about what Elizabeth said about storytelling. Elizabeth was a small group leader for a while, in our youth group, and she did an incredible job with this. And she's just really, I don't know, she's probably worked really hard at it, but she's naturally really good at it. And that storytelling thing, at some point, maybe we could do this in the future, but I would love to hear how telling stories of your past and telling stories of your life, how that helps kids deal with trauma and anxiety, how it does help them to attach to something. And I just want to bring that back up and say storytelling it's magic. It's magic.
That's good. All right, you guys, I think we're going to call it. I'm so grateful to all of you for your presence in our community, for how hard you work at your work. And so thanks for taking the time to think about these things, and to maybe voice some of your experience and expertise. I know it will be helpful to parents. My thanks to you. And to everybody who's listening, peace to you. We'll have hopefully more information and more communication coming from some of these same folks. If you are struggling, if you need, if you are out of your depth and need some help, you know how to get a hold of us at the church. We have just an awful lot of really sweet and talented people who would love to be in it with you. So if you have needs, emotional, psychological stuff that you feel like you need help interpreting, don't hesitate to ask. We can pair you up with somebody in our church who can maybe guide you toward a healthy place and getting help that you need. So thanks a lot, you guys. I appreciate you being part of this. Take good care, everyone.